The rain hammered against the windows of Gatcombe Park as Princess Anne sat in her private study, staring at the phone that had been ringing incessantly for the past hour. Staff members had been instructed not to disturb her, but the persistent calls from Buckingham Palace made it clear that something significant was unfolding within the royal family. Anne had always been known as the most straightforward member of the Windsor clan, never one to mince words or dance around uncomfortable truths. At 73, she had witnessed decades of royal scandals, family feuds, and public scrutiny that would have broken lesser individuals. But tonight felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that made her usually steady hands tremble slightly as she reached for the receiver. The voice on the other end belonged to her private secretary, James Morrison, who had served the royal family faithfully for over 20 years. His usually composed tone carried an edge of urgency that immediately put Anne on high alert. He explained that there had been developments regarding some long-buried family secrets that were threatening to surface in the most damaging way possible. For months, investigative journalists had been digging into the royal archives, following paper trails that led to uncomfortable questions about certain decisions made during the 1990s. These weren't matters of public interest or constitutional importance, but deeply personal family dynamics that had shaped the monarchy's recent history in ways the public had never fully understood. Anne listened intently as Morrison outlined the scope of the potential crisis. Documents had been uncovered that revealed private conversations between senior royals during some of the family's darkest moments. Phone records, personal letters, and even recorded conversations that had been thought destroyed were now in the hands of people who had no loyalty to the crown. The Princess Royal had always prided herself on her discretion, but she also understood that sometimes the truth needed to be spoken, regardless of the consequences. She had watched her family navigate crisis after crisis, often choosing silence and damage control over honest communication. Tonight, she was faced with a choice that would define how history remembered not just her, but the entire royal family. As Morrison continued his briefing, Anne's mind wandered to the conversations she had witnessed over the years. Heated arguments behind closed doors about Charles and Diana's troubled marriage, whispered concerns about Andrew's associations and the potential risks they posed to the monarchy. Frank discussions about Harry and Meghan's departure that painted a very different picture from the official statements released to the press. She had been present for many of these pivotal moments, often serving as the family's voice of reason when emotions ran high. Her military training and no-nonsense approach had made her a trusted confidant to her mother, the late Queen, and a respected figure among her siblings despite their various disagreements over the years. The documents in question reportedly contained Anne's own observations about family dynamics, recorded during a series of interviews she had given to the official royal biographer in 2019. These interviews were supposed to remain sealed for 50 years, but somehow excerpts had found their way into the wrong hands. Morrison's voice grew more tense as he explained that the leaked excerpts painted a picture of a family far more dysfunctional and calculating than the public had ever imagined. Anne's candid assessments of her relatives' characters and motivations had been recorded with the understanding that they would provide future historians with insight into the monarchy's evolution, not serve as ammunition for contemporary scandal. The princess felt a familiar surge of anger at the betrayal of trust, but also a strange sense of relief. For decades, she had watched the royal family's public image become increasingly divorced from reality. The carefully crafted statements and diplomatic non-answers had created a gulf between the institution and the people it was meant to serve. Anne had always believed that honesty, even when painful, was preferable to the elaborate deceptions that had become standard practice in royal communications. She had argued this point repeatedly in family meetings, often finding herself outnumbered by those who favored more traditional approaches to crisis management. Now, as she contemplated the implications of her recorded words becoming public, She realized that this moment presented an unprecedented opportunity. The family could choose to get ahead of the story, to control the narrative by embracing transparency rather than retreating into their familiar patterns of denial and deflection. Morrison was explaining the legal options available to prevent publication when Anne interrupted him mid-sentence. Her decision had been made with characteristic swiftness, and she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders as she prepared to set events in motion that would change everything. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windows as Anne began to outline her plan. She would not fight the release of her words, nor would she allow her family to launch another futile damage control campaign. Instead, she would take the unprecedented step of calling each family member personally to explain her position and prepare them for what was coming. These would not be the carefully choreographed conversations that typically preceded royal statements. There would be no press secretaries monitoring the calls or communications teams crafting talking points. Anne intended to speak directly, honestly, and completely about subjects that had been treated as forbidden territory for far too long. Morrison's shocked silence on the other end of the line confirmed what Anne had suspected. No one in the royal establishment was prepared for this level of departure from established protocol. But she had spent her entire life serving an institution that was struggling to remain relevant in a changing world, and she was no longer willing to prioritize image over integrity. As she ended the call with Morrison, Anne pulled out her personal phone and began scrolling through her contacts. The conversations ahead would be difficult, potentially relationship-ending, but absolutely necessary. She had watched her family sacrifice too much in service of maintaining facades that fooled no one and helped nothing. The first call would be to Charles, her brother, and the current king. Their relationship had always been complex, marked by mutual respect but fundamental disagreements about how the monarchy should evolve. Tonight's conversation would either bring them closer together or create a rift that might never heal. Anne checked the time and calculated that Charles would likely be in his private study at Clarence House, reviewing the day's papers and preparing for tomorrow's engagements. She knew he dreaded difficult conversations about family matters, preferring to delegate such unpleasantness to his staff whenever possible. But there would be no staff involvement tonight, no carefully worded statements or diplomatic evasions. Just two siblings who had spent decades navigating the impossible pressures of royal life, finally speaking to each other with complete honesty about the price they had all paid for their public roles. As she dialed the number, Anne felt a mixture of anticipation and sadness. These might well be among the last conversations she would have with her family as they knew her. Once the truth was fully revealed, relationships would inevitably change, and there would be no going back to the careful politeness that had characterized their interactions for so many years. The phone rang 3 times before Charles answered, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone who had already endured a long day of royal duties. Anne could hear the rustle of papers in the background and imagined him in his favorite chair, surrounded by the endless stream of documents that demanded his attention as king. "Charles, we need to talk," Anne began without preamble, her characteristic directness cutting through any possibility of small talk. "I've just spoken with Morrison about the leaked interviews, and I've made a decision that you're not going to like." The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long, punctuated only by the sound of papers being set aside. When Charles finally spoke, his voice had taken on the careful, measured tone he used when preparing for difficult conversations. He asked if this was something that could wait until morning, perhaps be handled through the proper channels with their respective private secretaries coordinating a response. Anne's laugh was sharp and humorless. She had watched her brother spend his entire reign trying to manage crises through intermediaries and official statements, maintaining a careful distance from anything that might be considered controversial or personally revealing. Tonight, she told him, there would be no intermediaries and no official statements crafted by communications teams. She explained her intention to allow the interviews to be published without legal challenge, and more importantly, her decision to expand on those recorded comments with additional revelations that she felt the public deserved to hear. Charles's sharp intake of breath was audible across the connection, followed by a string of objections about constitutional implications and the damage such disclosures might cause to the monarchy's standing. But Anne was unmoved by his concerns about protocol and precedent. She had spent decades watching the royal family sacrifice authenticity for the sake of maintaining an image that increasingly felt hollow and disconnected from reality. The institution they were trying so desperately to protect was already dying a slow death through irrelevance and public indifference. She began to recount specific incidents from their shared past, moments when the family had chosen deception over honesty and paid dearly for it in the long run, the way they had handled Diana's death, the years of denial about Andrew's poor judgment, the dismissive response to legitimate questions about the monarchy's role in modern Britain. All of it had contributed to a growing sense that the royal family was out of touch and unwilling to engage honestly with the concerns of ordinary people. Charles attempted to interrupt several times, arguing that some secrets were kept not out of selfishness, but to protect people who could be hurt by unnecessary revelations. He reminded Anne of the collateral damage that could result from her proposed course of action, the innocent parties who might suffer because of her decision to prioritize transparency over discretion. Anne acknowledged these concerns, but countered that the greater damage was being done by the family's continued refusal to be honest about their failures and shortcomings. She had watched public trust in the monarchy decline steadily over the years, and she believed that authentic communication, even when painful, was the only path toward rebuilding that trust. The conversation grew increasingly heated as Charles outlined the practical implications of Anne's decision. He spoke of constitutional crises, political ramifications, and the potential for her actions to provide ammunition to Republican movements that were already gaining strength in several Commonwealth countries. The monarchy, he argued, was bigger than any individual family member's desire for personal authenticity. But Anne had heard these arguments before, had participated in countless family meetings where they had chosen institutional preservation over personal integrity. She was tired of sacrificing truth for the sake of maintaining a system that seemed increasingly disconnected from the people it was meant to serve. She told Charles about a conversation she had overheard between their mother and her private secretary shortly before the Queen's death. The late monarch had expressed private doubts about whether the monarchy would survive another generation of scandals and evasions. The Queen had worried that the family's inability to communicate honestly with the public was slowly eroding the very foundation of their constitutional role. This revelation clearly shook Charles, who had always believed his mother was completely confident in the monarchy's future. Anne could hear him struggling to process this information, trying to reconcile it with his own understanding of the Queen's final years and her apparent satisfaction with the succession arrangements. Anne pressed her advantage, explaining that their mother had specifically mentioned her concerns about Charles's tendency to delegate difficult conversations and avoid direct confrontation with uncomfortable truths. The Queen had worried that this approach, while diplomatically sound, was creating a dangerous distance between the royal family and the British people. The conversation took another turn when Charles accused Anne of using their mother's memory to justify what he characterized as a reckless and selfish decision. He suggested that her real motivation was not transparency, but revenge against family members who had questioned her judgment over the years or failed to appreciate her contributions to the institution. Anne's response was immediate and fierce. She reminded Charles of the countless times she had supported him through difficult periods, often at personal cost to her own reputation and relationships. She had been one of the few family members to defend his marriage to Camilla when it was deeply unpopular, and she had consistently argued for his accession to the throne even when others harbored doubts about his readiness for the role. But Charles's accusation had touched on something deeper than professional disagreements or family loyalty. Anne admitted that she was indeed angry at decades of watching the family prioritize image management over genuine connection with the people they served. She was frustrated by the endless cycle of crisis and damage control that had defined royal communications for her entire adult life. She described the exhaustion she felt after years of maintaining careful facades, of choosing her words so carefully that authentic communication had become almost impossible. Every public appearance, every interview, every family gathering had become an exercise in diplomatic performance rather than genuine human interaction. Charles listened in growing alarm as Anne outlined her specific plans for the expanded revelations. She intended to discuss not just the family dynamics that had been partially revealed in the leaked interviews, but also the decision-making processes that had shaped the monarchy's response to major crises over the past 30 years. She would explain the real reasons behind certain royal divorces, the actual considerations that had influenced succession planning, and the private concerns that senior royals had expressed about their own fitness for their constitutional roles. Nothing would be off-limits, and no family member would be protected from honest assessment of their strengths and weaknesses. The call was approaching its second hour when Charles finally asked the question that Anne had been expecting. He wanted to know what it would take to change her mind, what compromises the family might be able to make to prevent what he saw as a catastrophic breach of protocol and privacy. Anne's answer was simple and devastating. She wanted the family to stop pretending that their private lives were fundamentally different from their public personas. She wanted an end to the careful choreography that had turned every royal interaction into a performance designed to maintain illusions about their wisdom, unity, and moral authority. Most importantly, she wanted acknowledgement that the monarchy's survival depended not on protecting its mystique, but on proving its relevance to people who were struggling with real problems and needed authentic leadership rather than ceremonial pageantry. Charles's final words before ending the call were a warning that Anne's actions would have consequences that extended far beyond her own reputation or relationships. He predicted that she would be ostracized by the family and criticized by constitutional experts who understood the delicate balance that had kept the monarchy functioning in an increasingly democratic world. Anne accepted these predictions with characteristic equanimity. She had never been motivated by a desire for popularity or acceptance, and she was prepared to face whatever consequences resulted from her decision to prioritize honesty over harmony. As she hung up the phone, she felt a mixture of sadness and relief, knowing that she had likely damaged her relationship with Charles, but had also finally spoken truthfully about issues that had been troubling her for decades. After ending the difficult conversation with Charles, Anne sat in the growing darkness of her study, contemplating the weight of what she had just set in motion. The rain had finally stopped, but the silence that followed felt more ominous than the storm itself. She knew that word of her decision would spread quickly through the tight-knit network of royal staff and advisors, creating a crisis atmosphere that would consume the next several days. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her daughter Zara, asking if everything was all right. News traveled fast within the family, and Anne suspected that Charles had already begun making calls to assess potential damage and rally support for whatever countermeasures he might attempt to implement. But Anne's decision was final, and she felt a strange sense of peace about the chaos that was surely about to unfold. The next call would be to her younger brother Andrew, a conversation that she anticipated would be even more difficult than the one with Charles. Andrew's scandals had been a source of family tension for years, and Anne's recorded interviews contained particularly harsh assessments of his judgment and character. She had been one of the few family members willing to confront him directly about his associations and behavior, often serving as an unwelcome voice of reason when others preferred to look the other way. Andrew answered on the first ring, his voice tight with anxiety. Word had already reached him through the Royal Communication Network, and he was calling not to discuss Anne's decision, but to beg her to reconsider. His reputation was already in tatters, he argued, and any additional revelations would make it impossible for him to rebuild his public standing or maintain any role within the royal family. Anne listened to his pleas with growing impatience. Andrew's primary concern seemed to be his own reputation rather than the broader questions about royal accountability that had motivated her decision. She reminded him of the conversations they had shared over the years, moments when she had tried to warn him about the potential consequences of his choices and been dismissed as overly cautious or unnecessarily judgmental. The conversation revealed the depth of Andrew's self-deception about his situation. He continued to believe that his problems were primarily about public relations rather than fundamental questions of judgment and character. Anne's recorded comments about his behavior were devastating precisely because they came from someone who had tried repeatedly to help him avoid the scandals that eventually destroyed his public role. She explained to Andrew that her decision was not motivated by a desire to punish him personally, but by a conviction that the royal family's credibility depended on acknowledging their failures rather than continuing to cover them up. The public was no longer willing to accept vague explanations and carefully worded denials when serious questions were raised about royal behavior. Andrew's response was a mixture of anger and desperation. He accused Anne of betraying family loyalty for the sake of personal vindication, suggesting that her real motivation was resentment about being overlooked and undervalued despite her decades of service to the crown. He painted her decision as an act of revenge against a family that had never fully appreciated her contributions. But Anne had anticipated this line of attack and was prepared for it. She acknowledged that she did feel undervalued at times, but insisted that her current decision was based on principle rather than personal grievance. She had watched the royal family's public standing deteriorate steadily over the years, and she believed that continued secrecy and damage control were only making the situation worse. The conversation with Andrew lasted less than 30 minutes before ending acrimoniously. He threatened to fight any attempt to publish information about his private conversations with family members, warning that he had his own recordings and documents that could prove embarrassing to other royals if the family descended into open warfare. Anne was unsurprised by this threat, having long suspected that Andrew maintained his own insurance policies against potential family betrayal. But she was no longer concerned about such considerations. Her decision to embrace transparency meant accepting whatever consequences might follow, including the possibility that other family members would retaliate with their own revelations. The final call of the evening would be to William, a conversation that Anne both dreaded and anticipated. William represented the future of the monarchy, and his reaction to her decision would largely determine whether the institution could survive the revelations she was about to unleash. Unlike his father and uncle, William had grown up in an era of constant media scrutiny and public skepticism about royal privilege and relevance. William answered immediately, his voice carrying a calmness that surprised Anne. He had clearly been briefed on the situation and had already begun thinking through the implications of her decision. Rather than arguing for damage control or expressing shock at her choice, he asked thoughtful questions about her motivations and goals. Anne found herself explaining not just what she intended to do, but why she believed it was necessary for the monarchy's long-term survival. She described her frustration with the endless cycle of scandal management that had defined royal communications for decades, and her conviction that authenticity was becoming more valuable than mystique in building public trust. William listened carefully before sharing his own perspective on the challenges facing the monarchy. He acknowledged that his generation of royals had grown up with different expectations about privacy and public disclosure, having never known a time when the family's personal lives were truly private. He understood Anne's argument that transparency might be preferable to the current system of half-truths and strategic omissions. But William also expressed concerns about the timing of Anne's revelations and their potential impact on ongoing efforts to modernize the monarchy from within. He described initiatives that were already underway to make the royal family more accessible and accountable, arguing that Anne's decision might undermine these careful reforms by creating a crisis atmosphere that would force everyone into defensive positions. Anne appreciated William's thoughtful approach, but remained unconvinced that gradual reform would be sufficient to address the monarchy's credibility problems. She had watched too many well-intentioned modernization efforts founder on the rocks of tradition and self-interest. The institution needed shock therapy rather than incremental change. The conversation with William was the longest and most substantive of the evening, touching on fundamental questions about the monarchy's role in contemporary Britain and the Commonwealth. They discussed the rising Republican sentiment in several countries, the generational divide in attitudes toward royal privilege, and the practical challenges of maintaining constitutional monarchy in an increasingly democratic world. William surprised Anne by suggesting that her revelations might actually serve the monarchy's interests if they were properly framed and contextualized. Rather than allowing the leaked interviews to be published without comment, he proposed that the family could take control of the narrative by providing a comprehensive account of their own evolution and learning from past mistakes. This suggestion intrigued Anne, who had not considered the possibility that her decision could become part of a larger strategic communication effort rather than simply a unilateral revelation of embarrassing truths. William outlined a vision for using the crisis as an opportunity to demonstrate the monarchy's willingness to be held accountable and to learn from criticism. But even as she appreciated William's political sophistication, Anne remained committed to her original plan. She had spent too many years watching the family promise reform while maintaining the same secretive and defensive approaches that had created their current problems. The time for careful strategic communication had passed, and what was needed now was genuine transparency, regardless of the short-term consequences. As the conversation with William drew to a close, Anne felt a mixture of hope and sadness. Hope because William clearly understood the challenges facing the monarchy and was thinking seriously about solutions. Sadness because she realized that her decision would likely damage her relationship with the family member she most respected and whose future success she most desired. William's final words were a request that Anne delay her revelations for 48 hours to allow him to discuss the situation with Catherine and to consider whether there might be alternative approaches that could achieve her goals without causing maximum damage to family relationships. He asked her to trust that he shared her concerns about the monarchy's future and was committed to meaningful change rather than cosmetic reforms. Anne agreed to the brief delay, recognizing that William's request came from genuine concern rather than a desire to buy time for damage control efforts. But she also made clear that her basic decision was final and that she would use the 48 hours to prepare for the comprehensive disclosure she had planned rather than to reconsider her fundamental approach. As she finally turned off the lights in her study and prepared for what would likely be a sleepless night, Anne reflected on the conversations she had just completed. Each family member had reacted differently to her decision, revealing their individual priorities, fears, and understanding of the challenges facing the monarchy. Charles had focused on institutional protection and constitutional implications, Andrew on personal reputation and family loyalty, and William on strategic opportunities and long-term reform. But none of them had questioned her basic assessment that the royal family's current approach to public communication was failing and needed fundamental change. The next few days would test whether Anne's gamble could achieve the transparency and accountability she believed were necessary for the monarchy's survival, or whether it would simply accelerate the institution's decline by removing the carefully maintained mystique that had protected it for generations. Either way, she was finally at peace with her decision to choose truth over tradition, regardless of the personal consequences that would inevitably follow.